In the shadows of the grand cathedrals and the bustling market squares of 16th century Europe, a storm was brewing. It was a storm that would shake the very foundations of Christendom, a storm that would see the rise of new ideas and the fall of ancient institutions. Imagine a world where the only source of truth was the Church, where every thought, every word, and every action was scrutinized and controlled. Now picture that world being turned upside down by a single book, a book that sold more copies than any other, except for the Bible itself. This book, and the man who wrote it, would change the course of history forever. The man was Desiderius Erasmus, and the book was his Colloquies. Erasmus was a Dutch scholar, a humanist, and a critic of the Church. He lived in a time when the Church held immense power, not just over the spiritual lives of people, but over their daily existence. The Church was the law, the government, and the ultimate authority. But Erasmus saw something different. He saw a Church that had strayed from its original purpose, a Church that was more concerned with power and wealth than with the teachings of Christ. When Erasmus's Colloquies was published, it was a sensation. 24,000 copies vanished from bookshops in the first rush. People couldn't get enough of it. The book was a collection of conversations that mocked the hypocrisy and corruption of the Church. It was funny, it was clever, and it spoke to the common people. For the first time, ordinary men and women could read about the Church's failings in a way that resonated with their own experiences. They saw that the Church was not the perfect institution it claimed to be, and they started to question everything they had been taught. The Church, of course, was not pleased. The Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe, issued an edict that any teacher caught using the Colloquies in a classroom should be executed on the spot. This was a drastic measure, but it shows just how much the Church feared Erasmus's ideas. Martin Luther, who would later become a key figure in the Protestant Reformation, initially agreed with the emperor. He said that on his deathbed, he would forbid his sons from reading Erasmus's Colloquies. But Luther, like many others, would soon change his mind. Luther was a professor at the University of Wittenberg, a respected member of the Catholic Church. He had his own issues with the Church, but he didn't think Erasmus's approach was the right one. Luther believed in reform from within, not in attacking the Church publicly. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the Church's problems were too deep to be fixed from the inside. In 1517, he nailed his famous 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, and the Protestant Reformation began. The Reformation was not just about Erasmus or Luther. It was a complex movement that involved many factors. One of these was the discovery of ancient texts and the revival of classical learning. Humanists like Erasmus were fascinated by the works of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers. They saw that these cultures had achieved great things before the birth of Jesus, and they wondered why the Church had always claimed that such achievements were impossible without the guidance of the Christian faith. This curiosity led to a broader questioning of the Church's teachings. Another factor was the political and social changes happening in Europe. The discovery of the New World and the expansion of trade routes brought new ideas and cultures into Europe. Explorers returned with stories of thriving civilizations that had never heard of Christ. This challenged the Church's claim that belief in the Savior was universal. It also raised questions about the nature of God and the role of religion in society. One of the most prominent figures of this time was Marguerite of Angoulême, the sister of the King of France. Marguerite was a woman of great influence and a patron of the arts. She was also a skeptic. In her work, The Mirror of the Sinful Soul, she expressed doubts about the Church and its leaders. She criticized the religious orders, approved of attacks on the Pope, and even went as far as to question the Scriptures. Marguerite's skepticism was a sign of the times. More and more people were beginning to question the Church's authority. The Church's response to these challenges was often harsh. Marguerite was accused of heresy and faced trial at the Sorbonne, the prestigious university in Paris. A monk even suggested that she should be sewn in a sack and thrown into the Seine River. But Marguerite was protected by her brother, the king, and she continued to support those who opposed the Church. One of these was John Calvin, the founder of Calvinism. Calvin was a refugee from the Inquisition, and Marguerite provided him with sanctuary. However, the new religious movements, including Calvinism, were not without their own problems. Calvin himself was known for his strict and sometimes intolerant views. He rebuked his protectress Marguerite for including skeptics in her court. The new Christians, it seemed, were just as bigoted as the old ones. But there was one significant difference. Their clergy were not as corrupt as those of the Catholic Church. The corruption within the Catholic Church was widespread and well known. Monks and priests were often guilty of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, usury, lending money at excessive interest rates, and embezzlement. Many of them lived lavish lifestyles, far removed from the poverty and simplicity that they were supposed to embody. Abbot Johannes Trithemius of Sponheim, a respected figure within the church, condemned his own monks for their immoral behavior. He wrote that they spent their days in filthy talk and play and gluttony, and that they neither fear nor love God. The situation was no better in England. Archbishop John Morton, who would later become a cardinal, accused Abbot William of St. Albans of simony, usury, embezzlement, and living publicly and continuously with harlots and mistresses within the precincts of the monastery. He also criticized the country's monks for leading a life of lasciviousness and for defiling holy places with their infamous intercourse with nuns. The public perception of the clergy was so poor that people felt insulted if they were called a monk, priest, or clerk. Eustace Chapais, the ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor to England, wrote that nearly all the people hate the priests. The Bishop of Mende, William Durand, observed that the church was in ill repute, and that the clergy set pernicious examples of gluttony for the laity. In Vienna, the priesthood had once been a desirable career for ambitious young men. But by the time of the Reformation, it had failed to attract any new recruits for 20 years. The clergy's reputation had fallen so low that young people no longer wanted to join their ranks. The Reformation brought many changes, some good and some bad. It led to the formation of new churches that were more focused on the teachings of the Bible and less on the traditions and practices of the Catholic Church. It also led to a greater emphasis on individual faith and personal interpretation of the Scriptures, but it also brought division and conflict. Wars were fought over religious differences, and many people lost their lives. Despite the challenges, the Reformation had a lasting impact on European society. It marked the beginning of a new era, one where people had more freedom to question authority and to seek their own paths to truth. The ideas of the humanists, the discoveries of the explorers, and the courage of reformers like Erasmus and Luther all contributed to this change. Today, we live in a world that is very different from the one Erasmus and Luther knew. We have more information at our fingertips than they could have ever imagined, and we have the freedom to choose our own beliefs. But the questions they raised are still relevant. What is the role of religion in our lives? How do we balance tradition with progress? And how do we ensure that those in power are held accountable? The story of the Reformation is a reminder that change is never easy, but it is often necessary. The world of the 16th century was transformed by the courage of a few individuals who dared to challenge the status quo. Their legacy lives on, and it continues to inspire us to think critically and to seek the truth, no matter where it may lead.